Let's start with North Carolina. North Carolina, and you can see on my screen now that picture is coming up now. But North Carolina in the news today, um, Governor Pat McCrory has declared that he's not going to change his position or his lawsuit against the Justice Department where it comes to HB2, the essentially the transphobic piece of legislation that requires people use the restroom based on the identity, on the gender that they were born at birth versus the identity for which they identify, the gender for which they identify. Also today, Attorney General Loretta Lynch came out saying that this legislation is discriminatory and that the Justice Department is going to sue or is suing the state of North Carolina, the University of North Carolina, as well as other stakeholders in the state for discrimination. She's saying at face value, this is a discriminatory act that's reminiscent of Jim Crow, that's reminiscent of days gone by where discrimination was codified in the United States. As a result of this lawsuit from Loretta Lynch and the Justice Department, the state of North Carolina is positioned to lose hundreds of millions of dollars of funding from the federal government. Now, we talked about this last week. The things that have changed today simply are the fact that you have competing lawsuits now, one coming from North Carolina, the other coming from the Justice Department. Immediately after Loretta Lynch did her press conference, Pat McCrory joined PBS NewsHour, where he stated the reason and the justification for his lawsuit, essentially saying that as a part of his lawsuit, he is seeking for the opportunity to get clarification of the law, particularly as it pertains to gender identity and the role of gender identity in the use of public facilities. He said that the federal government, or not the federal government rather, but the executive branch does not have the ability to interpret law. And so he is seeking to get clarification from the judicial branch stating how and where gender identity plays a role in the usage of public facilities and what constitutional right do they have to use restrooms that conform to, that align with their gender identity versus the gender that they were born at birth. I'm interested in this story for many reasons. One, because of the blatant fear mongering that's going on from the right, and lest I put this all at the feet of Republicans, those 11 Democrats, 5 of whom are Hillary Clinton supporters, signed onto this legislation, essentially codifying discrimination, using fear mongering as their number one tactic to get this passed. And I want to share on the screen it's a pretty offensive image, political cartoon that I want to share. And I'm sharing it because I want you to understand what goes on in the minds of people who are opposing or people who are promoting this legislation. We're all adults. We can handle this. So this is a political cartoon, and I don't have to, I don't have to interpret it for you, but this is the type of propaganda that is used to push this fear-based legislation that is spreading across the country. This is something that I was tagged in, and instead of me letting them have it on Facebook, I said, let me just save it for the show. Because this is the image, this is what they want to spread. Enough of that. This is what they want to spread across the United States as a way, as a means of justifying this legislation that is both discriminatory, but it's also a means to control on the state level local municipalities and municipalities, local city governments, from making their own anti-discrimination or discrimination policies. So it is a very nefarious thing that these states are doing, and these political leaders, primarily on the right, primarily Republican, primarily conservative Christians, they're doing this as a means of control and as a means of trying to keep things the way they were. And political cartoons like the one I showed is right in line, as disgusting as that cartoon was, it is right in line with what a lot of conservatives tend to think with regard to not just the transgender community, but specifically in this case, the transgender community. This type of perverting and fear mongering goes to everything that they oppose, right? They draw this caricature of everything they oppose, every person they oppose, and every community they oppose. They draw a twisted, demented, devil-like caricature of the human beings that are now subject to the rules that they create. They're subject to the blowback from this type of propaganda, because you can't spread propaganda like that. You can't spread fear like that, and you can't spread hatred like that and not see real tangible ramifications in the lives of the transgender community. You can't. It's not possible. And this is something that I will give PBS NewsHour credit for, because they continue to hit Pat McCrory on the fact that this legislation alone is a means of continuing, or would he at least admit that this further exacerbates the trauma that this particular community has faced, much of which we're not even capable of describing, right? We're not even capable of identifying with, because it's not something that happens to us that are not transgendered. But legislation like this is passed using fear tactics, using just using the most disgusting techniques possible, and the legislation is passed. So now you have a double whammy impact on the lives of transgender people. Now they are faced with not able to use public facilities for the gender for which they identify, but then they're also faced with the blowback from this type of legislation, these types of conversations, and this type of propaganda that's used to pass this type of legislation. Now, with all that being said, I want to point out something that McCrory, I think, and legal scholars, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I actually think that depending on the makeup of the Supreme Court, if this actually reaches the Supreme Court coming from McCrory, then it is an opportunity for the Supreme Court to give some final say in terms of what America will look like for the transgender community. And I think this is McCrory's way of passing the responsibility to be a decent human being off his shoulders and onto the shoulders of the judicial system, which is, at the end of the day, I think, if it depends on what the final makeup is. I'm not even sure that with the 4-4 split, that something like this would be decided, or if it would be sent back to a lower court. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out. And this is a part of the unfortunate growing pains, this legal process, not the bigotry. Well, unfortunately, the bigotry is a part of America. Right. And if we're ever going to grow beyond the bigotry, we have to confront the bigotry. So that, too, I would say, is a part of the unfortunate growing pains. But this is something that's finally come to a head. And it's a signal to Mississippi. It's a signal to Georgia. It's a signal to all the other states that are wanting to pass this legislation, that the federal government is going to, at least the executive branch, per the Justice Department, is going to fight on behalf of the transgendered community. So we'll keep our eye on that story as more information comes out. But I thought today was an interesting day, particularly because it brought the state of North Carolina to heads, in a heads up match with the federal government. And let's see what happens. But always remember that this legislation wasn't just passed with Republicans. It was also passed with Democrats as well. So when they say unite blue, which blue are they talking about? Those blue that voted for this.